international peace operations are often discussed as a form of intervention, which generates discussions on sovereignty versus international human rights, and it relates to this debate on the responsibility to protect and protection of civilians and so on. But this discussion doesn't really grasp the nature of most peace operations, which are conducted with the consent of a host government and that involve many different types of collaborations between international and local actors. Often a lot is invested in local NGOs, and a new kind of NGO sector is emerging. And this is a relationship which has an aspect of intervention, but it's not the same as kind of outside intervention as in the military intervention type. So what we need to do is to actually conceptualize this type of intervention as a form of governance, instead of speaking of it still as intervention or non-intervention, and therefore unproblematic from a sovereignty perspective. Because it's still problematic when it has this governance component. So, for instance, this scholar Shahar Hameiri, he, in a book called Regulating Statehood, introduced the notion of transnational governance as the result of international efforts to build states in conflict-ridden countries. And this transnational governance is not about international actors trying to do good and then local actors either accepting or resisting this objective. It's a different kind of theoretical model. So in this model he sees the transnational governance as a continuation both of international security interests as a form of international risk management, which is why it makes sense for states to really invest a lot in this. And on the other hand, a continuation of local struggles for power. So the local actors that engage in these operations often adopt the language of peace and state building and so on, but in his model it will always have this conflict dimension. So this is important to understand before we start to evaluate the consequences for state sovereignty, for the human rights promotion and so on. In South Sudan, there were very high hopes for peace after independence in 2011. And then in 2013, there was this political crisis with a split in the government and the outbreak of a sort of civil war that had very serious consequences for the eventual development of the country. There's still a very serious political crisis, and it has affected all the international efforts at building a new state in South Sudan. So, reflecting on this, some observers, like the scholar Mahmoud Mamdani, have blamed the international peacemakers for this failure. He says that the international efforts to make peace were made on the wrong grounds, and therefore they are to blame for this. They should perhaps even be held accountable. The people who have been involved in this, and also many other scholars who have followed this very carefully, see this as a very provocative statement, because they know there was a very serious, long war in Sudan that was ended in 2005 through these international efforts. And the alternative to this peace agreement and the eventual independence of South Sudan was not necessarily a better or more ideal solution. It was continued warfare, they will argue. So, for instance, Hilde Fraford Johnson, who was centrally involved in that in those negotiations, and who was eventually the SRSG and leader of the UNMISS operation in South Sudan. She, in her reflections on this, opposes this view very strongly that the national actors actually had the possibility to determine the outcome of the peace process. So this leaves us with two competing accounts, where one sees the national peace efforts as part of the problem and something that should be held accountable when it fails, and the other sees it as not having the power to impose things on local parties, and rather something that just needs to be tried without necessarily succeeding every time.